Good morning, everyone, and hi. um, it's funny to start these Facebook Lives because I want them to be conversational. I don't want them to be like lectures. But what's interesting about doing a Facebook Live by yourself is they end up being lectures unless people are here to watch live. So I wanted to take advantage of this platform to revisit a TED Talk I gave in 2016, which was a complete failure. I for reasons that I've learned since make sense. I thought I had to memorize a speech, a 12-minute speech, memorize it, and I forgot it because my gift is not in memorization. My gift is in improvisation and connecting. And I completely did not do that. I was looking above the audience's head. I was just in my head trying to remember this amazing wisdom I was here to impart, and I forgot it. So I, I put it in the notes here. You can look, but I decided to do it again today and put it on the podcast because I do need a podcast for this week. So I'm going to just tell you. Actually, I'm going to be completely honest and I'm going to tell you I'm going to read it. I'm reading my TED Talk that I gave in 2016 because I liked the message of it. I hated the delivery of it. The delivery of it was horrible. And I never connected to the message of it. So I want to do that today with you. Um, and just so that I have it on a public forum where the message can get delivered. So I'm going to try that here, and then I'm going to come back afterwards and talk a little bit about it. So I'm going to just go through this TED Talk. I'm going to put it in uh, the format of a podcast, like I always do here, and then I'll come back. So if you're watching live, thank you. You don't need to, but if you're watching live, thanks for sticking in there. And if you're watching later, this is what I wished I would have delivered in the TED setting back in 2016. So I'm going to do the countdown and then we'll go from there. I might give a little bit of this intro there too, so bear with me. 3, 2, 1. Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Circle Up and Get Real, which I believe is the beginning of season 5? No, could that be? Season 5. I think we're starting season 5. And this will be episode 209, I think, around there. I didn't look before I came on here. So today I am jumping back into a negative experience that I had back in 2016 where I did a TEDx talk, which was one of my bucket list items, and I completely forgot. Like I stared at the camera and forgot what I was going to say. It was horrible at the time, and it took me a long time to recover. And now, even 8 years later, I've never watched that TED talk. I've never revisited any part of that because it was in the past. And as I was talking about this yesterday in one of my membership groups, it occurred to me that I've learned a lot since then. In those 8 years, I've learned a lot. And one of the things that I've learned is that my gift is connection and not lecture. And it felt like I was lecturing that night when I think back on it. And I think the message I wanted to deliver got lost in the drama of forgetting the memorization of it. So today, I just wanted to revisit the message of that TED Talk and give you a chance to take a listen. I think it's 12 minutes because that's what I was supposed to do when I had the script approved and had to time it and do all the things you do when you prepare for a TED Talk, which I would never do again, though that way. So bear with me. I'm going to give you my TED Talk. It's called What Kind of Question Is That? Ahas, game changers, pivotal points can move us toward or further from our actual dreams. And often they come to us as questions. One of my first aha moments happened in my 4th grade classroom. There I was, a curious 10-year-old with what I believed to be a very compelling and, to me, important question. Mrs. Henry, why is a dollar sign an S with a line through it, and a cent sign is a C with a line through it? I'm certain, like any great and probably a bit frustrated 4th grade teacher, mine said something like, Jodee, look it up. But what I heard was, don't ask questions, Jodee. If you ask questions, it means you're not smart. Only dumb people ask questions. You're disrupting the entire class, and I really expected better from you. So look it up instead of bothering the entire class with your silly questions. There was what happened, and then there was the story I told, made up, about what happened, and that story, over time, became my truth. This episode became a defining moment in my development. I decided at 10 years old that it wasn't okay to ask questions. Were there good things to come from my early decisions? Sure. I learned to be self-sufficient. I learned to be independent. But I also decided that whenever I was faced with a question in my curious brain, I needed to stifle it. I stopped asking. If I didn't participate, at least I wouldn't be wrong. And in my mind, that was one thing I could be right about. When faced with moments of truth, many people will fall into reaction mode. Our reactions come from our emotions and don't require any thought. They are automatic and generally based on something from our past, something that might have been planted into our subconscious by someone else. Fight or flight is a primitive reaction that comes from our limbic system. When we feel threatened, we either fight back or leave, neither of which can ever create the opportunity for a new outcome. So what do you do when you have a decision to make? Do you allow your limbic system, your reptile brain, to take over? Or do you respond from your thinking brain? I'm sure you've sat quietly in your own life, whether in a classroom or a boardroom, and chosen not to ask the question that's burning in your mind. What will they think of me if I admit I don't have an answer? Am I the only one who's not following this? Because we've been conditioned to look outside ourselves for the answer, we've given in too easily to what we already know how to do and have sacrificed our own why, our own purposes, our own interests, and our own knowing. I don't need to take responsibility for a how question because I'm looking for someone else's idea, solution, or answer. Until I've established my own why, no one else's how will fit. Just imagine how different our world would be if those kids who turned into the wizards of Silicon Valley, California in the 80s had been afraid to ask questions, to challenge the status quo. They were the hippies and free spirits from the 60s. They didn't ask permission. They just questioned everything, followed their curiosity, and found their own solutions. If the first idea didn't work, they just kept going. Those hippies and free spirits of the 60s were just crazy enough to actually believe they could change the world. And they did. In his book, A More Beautiful Question, Warren Berger traced the origins of many breakthrough inventions and disruptive business startups, everything from the making of the cell phone to the birth of the internet, along with the launches of the companies Netflix, Nest, and Dropbox, and found that each began with a person pursuing an insightful question no one else was asking at the time. The questions led to answers that eventually have led to billion-dollar paydays. It has been said that in Silicon Valley today, questions are the new answers. They were asking questions that no one else was asking. Consultant and author Peter Block reminds us that while there is depth in the question, how do I do this? Questions that begin with how are a defense against action. I can imagine that the wizards of Silicon Valley were much more interested in why questions that deal with purpose and depth. You've probably heard the riddle, what do you do when you find yourself in a hole? Well, the answer is stop digging. But that would mean stopping. And for many of us, our salvation when things aren't working the way we wish they would is to keep busy, keep digging. Instead of getting closer to the top of the hole, we do more of what got us there in the first place, and we end up deeper and deeper inside. Your life is yours, and the results you create are up to you. Instead of desperately pursuing an ordinary, normal existence, what if you took that ordinary experience of life and just added something extra? Extraordinary. Just more of ordinary means that it's okay not to know. Instead of looking backward at what we want to change, what if we just sat in the not knowing and asked better questions of ourselves? I'm certain Thomas Edison and Henry Ford and Harvey Firestone didn't have all the answers. Back in the early 1900s, those three were part of a mastermind group that met twice a week to support each other in the wild and crazy ideas each of them were working on. Can you even imagine the brain power that had to have been present in those boardrooms? Ford was the one who said that thinking is the hardest work we will ever do, which is probably the reason so few people do it. Although not formally educated, he knew exactly where to go to get the resources he needed whenever he needed them. Firestone firmly believed that the best asset people have is their ideas. He once said, "The way of the pioneer is always rough." And he would certainly know that, being one of the first global manufacturers of automobile tires. Edison believed that restlessness and discontent were the first necessities of progress. Don't you suppose the reason he invented the things he invented was to answer those questions he had about the way things were? Curious leaders would rather pose the right questions that give them a deeper understanding than compete to deliver answers in hopes of acknowledgement. Sensationally curious leaders have the additional strengths of being reflective, receptive, and perceptive. They're able to dissect any issue and get to its core because they keep asking themselves and others that vital question: why? You can't transform what you don't even notice, so start with yourself. What questions do you find yourself asking when no one else is around? Is the voice in your head a friendly voice or a judgmental one? What frustrates and upsets you the most? These are clues to some of the possibilities that already exist inside of you that can't come alive until they're recognized. So when you meet the president of your college, or the president of your company, or the president of the United States, what question will you have for him or her? What do you do when faced with a decision? Are you awake to the possibilities, or are you fighting desperately to go back to sleep? Which voice calls loudest to you, the voice of fear or the voice of faith? I love the theme of this TEDx event, pivot. I learned about pivoting as a high school and eventually a college basketball player right here at this college. When you pivot in basketball, you ground yourself with one foot, leaving the other one free to move around, to get a different perspective, and hopefully to get around the defense. If you consider your own life as a continual opportunity to pivot, to maintain your core values by remaining grounded on the one foot, but always being free to explore and examine from another point of view with the other, you will build your trust muscles so you concentrate less on the planted foot and more on the one that's free to explore, to challenge the familiar and move to new transformational action. When you find yourself at a pivot point, here are some ideas to consider in order to move you from where you are to where you're going. Number 1, notice what you notice. Be awake to what draws your attention, what enlivens you, what frustrates you. All of this information in form and inspiration in spirit is custom designed to wake you up. The messages and lessons are there all the time. What are you seeing? Number 2, be committed to asking good questions. Of yourself first, and then when you know who you really are and are aware of your why, then, and only then, seek out the resources, the people, the mentors who will help you get there. You will never know what is possible if you don't ask, but make sure the questions are good ones. And finally, commit to transformation as opposed to change. Change looks backward, and transformation creates the future based on what you know right now in the present. Be willing to give up beliefs that were handed to you by someone else, but that no longer serve the you are becoming. Take the action that challenges your comfort zone without compromising your own values. As for the question of the dollar sign, I'm sure I did look it up. And while I don't remember the answer, I remember that question very well, even this many years later. In fact, sometimes the answer is really not as important as the pursuit of knowledge. Why is whatever is important to you important to you? And why is that important to you and to the world? When you dig just a little deeper than ordinary, you will give and receive that little extra. When you cause someone else to think, you create an impression. When you cause yourself to think, you inspire a legacy. Your life will either be an example or a warning. Choose wisely. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. So that was what I had written back in the day. And it's so funny to reread that now and go, man, that was good. Even back then in 2016, there were elements of that speech that I, as I read it again, have created who I am becoming. The willingness to be curious, the willingness to hold on to questions. And since then, since that speech that I bombed, I've experienced things myself. I've asked too many questions in some people's eyes, and I've been asked to leave two situations that I was partnering or connected, collaborating with. I've been asked to leave two of them because I asked too many questions. And it's really funny to look back 8 years ago and see how that one speech that I bombed really made an impression on me. Pivot by leaving your values foot firmly planted. But use the other foot to see what you're not seeing from your grounded stance. That's kind of brilliant. I'm really glad I thought of that, and really seriously had not even revisited it until today. I did not read this speech yesterday when I printed it out. I didn't read it. I read it with you live here because it was an opportunity for me to hear it at the same time. So what I learned, one of the biggest lessons for me in hindsight and reflection, was that I'm not here to deliver live a memorized speech. That's not my gift. That's not my calling. There are people who are brilliant at that. Brilliant at that. Platform speaking is hard. It's really hard. I'm not gifted in that way. I don't know if I would say gifted, but one of my strengths is connecting and listening and following a conversation to a whole different set of questions. And I learned that when I think back on it. I learned that in my first job out of college as a journalist. I was a newspaper editor, news and sports editor. And while I had my list of questions I was going to ask when I did features reporting, I remember distinctly the one time I went in with my list of questions and didn't even use them because the interviewee went in a completely different direction than I had intended. And in that moment, I realized that the conversation live is way more important than whatever I had intended coming in. And I suppose that was the beginning of the distinction for me in being attached and being committed. If I'm committed to getting a great story, I need to give up being attached to my questions that I was there to ask or my direction that I was there to have it go. And I wonder if in leadership we had the opportunity, we do have the opportunity, but if we had the desire to actually connect before we correct or before we adjust or redirect people's behavior, if we could just connect first, I wonder how things might be different. Last night I went to an event where a former North Dakota Democratic congressperson and a former North Dakota Republican governor were there to talk about how we can actually come together if we look at politics as people first and not the processes and policies first. It seems really obvious when I say it like that, but we're not in that world right now. We're not in the world of wanting what's best for most. At least it doesn't occur that way to me. There's so much anger and so much pent up frustration and so much fighting against. Look at any level of politics, your local city commission, your statewide, your national. I mean, everything seems to me to be a way to get somebody on a different side. And then what do we do when we're sided? We fight against each other. We don't look at the common goal, the common outcome, the common desire, it seems. It seems we're looking at how we can win or beat the other person or the other side. It just feels like something's shifted. And there are lots of ideas and theories about what happened and how we've gotten here. I listen to NPR, and that's just a source for me that helps me understand things through the way I look at them. And I think one of the challenges we have is that we have our own news sources and our own ways that we look for information. And for many of us, it's to find out how we can validate what we already know. And we don't typically do a great job at staying in the conversations that are difficult. I haven't. I look for evidence to prove I'm right. I've done that. And that's a sign of an unconscious leader or an unconscious situation, based on the book I've shared in this podcast before, the 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership. It's just a horizontal line across a piece of paper. Above the line is conscious and below the line is unconscious. And if you find yourself in any situation in your life, any situation, open and curious and committed to learning, you're conscious. But if you find yourself closed, defensive, and committed to being right, you're unconscious. And it seems to me that you wouldn't notice yourself below the line, because as soon as you notice yourself below the line, you become conscious. When you notice yourself that you are committed to being right, over committed to being to learning, wouldn't you just then shift from unconscious to conscious? So maybe that's the first thing to start noticing. Do I spend most of my life frustrated with the other side and trying desperately to find evidence to prove that I'm right? Or do I spend most of my time wondering and being curious and looking at situations from a different vantage point than only mine? I think if we start doing that and we just start noticing how it feels, how do I feel in my life? Do I feel tense and fighting like I want to be defensive? Because I have to be offensive if I'm feeling defensive as well, right? Because it's a game, push, push, push. Or do things fascinate me? And am I curious about them before I get furious about them? Something to consider. It's what I'm working on, and I'll continue to work on. And I'll continue to ask questions because it's just who I am. So literally, thank you for coming to my TED Talk. And as always, everybody, get real. We'll talk to you again. Bye.